action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing and advertising. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today I've caught Lee Davies. He described himself recently as a right mess, but we call him hugely and diversely talented, as Lee is a designer, art director, writer and strategist with an interest in all things marketing, design and behavioural science related. Hailing from Cheshire, he's been designing great work for the creative brand communications agency Peter and Paul for 12 years, the last two of which have seen him sat in the position of creative director. Lee says a good branded piece of work has language at its heart. Welcome to the show, Lee.
Thanks very much. I feel like because of the sort of level of luminaries that you've had on your show, I feel quite honoured to have been asked, so thanks very much.
Oh, it's good to have you here. So we start off with our quick fire questions, Lee. So there's 7 to put to you. Tea or coffee?
It's got to be tea, hasn't it?
Yorkshire, presumably.
Yeah, well, if we're going to play the stereotypical card, yeah.
That's what we're all about here. Pen or pencil?
I think, pencil's nice to feel like you're kind of an artist, really, rather than, doing a kind of like pen pushing job.
Late nights or early starts?
Oh, it used to be late nights, and now it's got to be early starts. There's no choice, really. Form
or function?
Oh, God. I think I'd have to say, I'm going to cop out and say both.
Serif or sans serif?
Depends. You can't possibly choose between the two of those.
These aren't meant to be easy.
Go for sans then. It makes me sound like a spotter. I'm really not a type spotter.
This one's ridiculous. Lorem or ipsum?
Lorem.
And finally, Peter or Paul?
Oh, God. I can't. I'm going to go... Yeah, I can't do that either. It's got to be both. I mean, it's got to be both, hasn't it? You expect me to go into work tomorrow and not be killed.
Oh, dear. No, that's fine. Well played. Now, Lee, I'm clearly familiar with some of your background, more so perhaps than our listeners, seen as we were on the same degree course. But can you tell us how your career started and how you ended up in Sheffield?
So, I grew up in a little town in the northwest of England, in Cheshire, called Middlewich, which is like it's a bit of a tragically uncultural place, as in it's just a small town with a canal running through it. So there's not really any sort of art and design culture at all. The first time I went to an art gallery, I think I was about 18, 19, so I was really late to it. So, but I did do that thing that a lot of young kids do where you know that you can draw, and then you just think, well, that's got to be, it's like my only option. Now, we had quite an all right sort of art and design college in a neighbouring town, which I went to, and just sort of properly focused on art and design as being the only real way out of there, and ended up getting into Bristol at a time when I didn't really know much about Bristol at all. In fact, I don't even really know why I chose it. I think it was just because somebody else at our college was going there. Kind of really liked it, but when I got there, I had to play catch up really, because I was around quite well schooled, artistic people, certainly in the house that I lived in. And having come from where I'd come from, the reason why I was into art and design really was because I could draw and quite liked comics. So I was pretty behind the curve. And so when I got to Bristol, met quite a lot of quite intelligent, middle-class people that had come out of really good courses. And it was just, it was quite a bit of a culture shock. I remember because our newspaper in Middlewich was called the Middlewich Guardian. And I didn't know that there was another Guardian. newspaper. So I went to Bristol and met some people, and they used to like have discussions about what they'd read in the Guardian. And I was like, "What? You can't? What? You get the Middlewich Guardian?" Like, it was kind of really having to play catch up, I think. But being in Bristol was a really good place to do that. And I think the people that we met on our course, I mean, I always think about studying there as the people that you study with, they're just as kind of inspirational as the people that teach you, aren't they? And I was really, still good friends with lots of people from there. And, you know, I remember somebody that we're still friends with in our student house she was on fine art. So she was doing this project where she was making plasticast, almost teardrops, if you like, putting them into balloons and hanging balloons. And so they were making these sort of teardrops, but this was for a self-portrait project. And it just completely I was not at the races at all. So it was kind of, it was like quite bizarre to be there.
So how did you go from the focus on art and drawing then to a career in design?
Well, I think that it probably started when I was at college in Cheshire. I think I got into that course thinking that graphic design was basically illustration, and that's probably what I was going to do. So obviously there was a lot that I learned there about what graphic design was, that there was such a thing as typography and things like that. And I suppose then being at Bristol and having that kind of freedom which it gave you, it did give us quite a lot of freedom, that course, to sort of find your feet as to what you wanted to create. And when I got out of the course, I was quite bookish. Like it's that typical thing which you see from a lot of design students about designing books. So I thought that a kind of life in the world of publishing was probably what was calling. And so kind of dragged my portfolio around London and tried to go to as many studios as I could and go to sort of a few publishing houses, magazines, and things like that. Nothing ever really kind of came off, and I managed to get a placement in Bristol for a couple of months, and that was at a sort of design and branding studio. And then whilst I was there, because they'd given me an email address, I thought, oh, well, now I can email other studios looking like I'm a proper person, because it was Lee at 13.co.uk. So it was like it wasn't like a Hotmail address. So I used that time to try and contact people, and then eventually got a job in Nottingham for a while at a little agency called Purple Circle, and sadly no longer exist. They were really good. They gave me like tons of rope to hang myself with. They just used to let me do whatever I was doing, really. My work wasn't really under very much scrutiny there. And then ended up coming to Sheffield, working for an agency and meeting Pete and Paul, because they worked there too, and then was aware of their studio and always really liked the work they were doing, and was there then just lucky enough to end up there, really, and that was 12 years ago.
Wow, and you work from the Testone factory. Can you tell us a bit more about what that is?
So I'd been at the studio for maybe 10 or 11 years. We'd initially, where we were, was in this kind of loft space in a kind of industrial type sort of factory building, warehouse building, and then we'd moved to a sort of old school, and then it became possible for them to sort of purchase their own building. So what happened was we commissioned a client. So we'd done a piece of work for two architects called Tatum and Tatum, and they were setting up a sort of development practice, and they commissioned us to do their branding and name the development practice. We named it Noiscape. And through the process of doing that project, they were a great client, actually, because they tested us a lot. They interrogated the work that we were doing a lot. And we subsequently became good friends with them. So we ended up commissioning them to design our new space. And so it's quite interesting because we were like client side of the table then. And I'd never been there before. It was quite mad to actually have somebody presenting design like back to us. I found that quite a nice experience. And they came in and did this presentation of work where there are three kind of directions to take. And they had this model of the studio out on the table. And each time they discussed another route, somebody took like some little tweezers and moved walls around with these little tweezers and moved like the little cutouts of people. And so we were quite involved in the process there. And then we designed sort of like key objects in the space. Like there's a huge black sort of table that we all sit around that's massive. It ought to have a name, really. It doesn't yet. There's a few kind of other key pieces in there. I was probably a bit of a pain in everybody's arse because I was insistent that there be a wall that we could pin work, because I really felt like that was a massively important part, certainly to the way I work. And since that we work in a team, it's that thing, always having the work on show. It does enable people to just see stuff and, like walk past you one day and go, oh, I was looking at that and I saw this the other day. Have you tried this about it? So, there was kind of elements of the space that we fed into. It felt like a real sort of collaborative process, really, with James and Tom Tatum and doing the space.
And has it evolved any more since then, or was it perfect?
Well, no, actually, it's funny you should say that, because I think that we've been in there for about a year and a bit, and I think with any architectural build, there does need, and in fact, actually, with any piece of design, there does need to be kind of points where you revisit, make sure it's still doing the things you need it to do. So there'll probably be a bit of a phase 2 piece of work to be done in that space. And that just comes as the result of being in it, working in it, and, like finding some things that do work for you and some things that don't. Because we've got the luxury, I suppose, in Sheffield that space is relatively inexpensive. So we've got quite a large space. So we use the space, as well as being a studio to work in, we also use it as a place to host kind of other kind of uncommercial creative things, if you like. So we've had like supper clubs there and an art auction and a synth building workshop. So we kind of use it in quite a lot of different ways. So it's bound to be the case, really, that there'll be a point where we just keep revisiting and tweaking, really. But by and large, like the skeleton of what's there is pretty good.
And you use that wall where you stick work up. Is that something that everyone's incorporated now into how they work?
Kind of. Well, maybe not. I think I'm probably the most sort of vocal about that, but I sort of need that wall a lot in any work that I do, because there's us all working around the same desk as kind of, it's totally 50-50 really, because you've got that kind of open plan group work thing, which is absolutely what you need. I think it's definitely what I need. But then there are times when you need to do more deep work where you need to get away from that. But working in solitary confinement, I can't really do that. I was actually did a bit of work on Sunday from the studio and found the whole experience completely weird. To be round this massive desk alone, I do kind of need to see that work all the time, and to also have people tell me what they do or don't like about it. It might be a bit needy, but I think it's just, I don't know, I think it's definitely just trying to not be secretive about what you're doing and make sure you get people to look at it at the earliest point, because although you are a bit precious about it, so long as people see it really early, then even if you get that little confidence boost of someone going, oh, that's quite interesting, then you can push it a bit further. And it's that, what's that saying? Saying none of us are as good as all of us. Yeah, I'm a bit like, I think that's totally where I'm coming from with it, really.
I think, so open plan studios, we've an open plan studio here, and in fact, we're actually in the process of very loosely planning our next office space. And having that open plan is, as I say, subjective. There's instances where it's probably counterproductive, but you're clearly a fan.
Yeah, I mean, it is. There are instances when it's counterproductive, and yeah, there are times when you're doing like more deeper thinking, that being in a room where there's like lots of potential noise is not great. And I know other people in the studio kind of, they probably suffer with that maybe slightly more than I do, especially because I guess the stage of work that I come in does require quite a lot of discussion. So there are other designers that are working more to kind of deliver a final piece where they will need quiet. But I don't know. I think that the alternative of not having an open space, I think what you'd be doing is you'd be having a discussion about how that doesn't work either. Do you know what I mean?
True. Are there any other conditions or habits or tips that you think you can share with our listeners that do also aid creativity and that design process?
Well, it's funny because over the years, and this might be a kind of like getting a bit older and getting a bit longer in the tooth, I've tended to come at projects from a point that's a bit further back than the actual piece of design, if that makes sense. So you could call that strategy. It doesn't seem to be like a really reliable definition of what strategy isn't, though. Some people have an idea of what it is for them. And what I'm talking about might be something different. I suppose what I'm on about is like the context of the project and who it's for and what the organisation is and who the people are that they want to communicate to, the audience. And so changing my mode of work really to really take in that earlier stage has done loads for my ability to do the work. So that might mean you're in a situation where you're in a room full of people and you're running a bit of a workshop type thing. But I think it's really important to keep the creative kind of present at that point. So we've just done a project recently, which is a piece of branding for London Borough of Culture, which in 2020 is going to be Brent, which is where Wembley Stadium is. Now, obviously, we're a creative studio in Sheffield, so we had to do loads of learning about what the area is all about. So we were running kind of groups, community advisor groups and youth groups, and just doing a few exercises in trying to get to that brief, really. And we had our copywriter who we were working with was in one of those groups, and he walks out of the group and he's kind of got the idea. So I think really an aid to creativity for me has been about making sure that line's really blurred between what you might call strategy or the context of the project and then the creative, and to not almost have a sort of like defined line between the two, because what you don't want as a creative is to have, you know, like a kind of load of information that might be like the positioning, if you like, and then you say to your creative people, right, go off and colour it in, and make sure it's not too dull.
Yeah, and it devalues that part of the process equally.
Yeah, I think it's just what it does is it means that I suppose you could say that then by keeping that quite fluid, it means that the creative people think a bit more strategically, if you like, and then the strategy is a bit more creative. Because I don't know, I think that it's like seeing it as a process where the two things can swap over quite a lot, and you're constantly trying to think about how to solve it. But aside from that, I think that there's that book, isn't there? What is it? A Technique for Producing Ideas. And in that, its basic premise is that get your head into all the information, understand everything about it that you need to, and then completely walk away from it. And I definitely subscribe to that, because I think most of the better ideas that we've had, certainly I've had, possibly haven't happened actually at the desk. They might be somewhere else. I went through a bit of a phase of really liking going on little school trips where if you had to do a project for somebody, you went along to like surreptitiously went along and tried to kind of consume what they wanted you to communicate, and then came away with information. We did it once where we had to do a piece of work for an open day for a university, so I went and pretended to be like a mature student and got quite a lot of it. So I had the ideas on the train on the way home, really.
Amazing. I called you a writer in the introduction, but I believe by your own admission you said there may be copywriters you work with who could be listening who might challenge that definition, but presumably you're being slightly modest there.
Yeah.
But brand identity, to just give you one example, is clearly like a comprehensive mix of both visual and verbal attributes.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So how do you work with language in what you do?
Yeah, because I think I was listening to a podcast the other day. It might have been one of yours, I don't know. I heard a copywriter say, "Oh, you get those art directors that think they can write copy, and we have to tell them they can't." And I was like listening to it, thinking, "Shit, do I do that?" Because I do think that, for me anyway, the language part of the job, and you're dead right. I think, especially if you're doing a piece of brand identity work, for me, the language part of the job it comes hand in hand really with how you visually kind of execute what you're doing. And because it goes back to working in a small team, there's a team of 9 of us, And obviously, when I started, it was smaller still. And I think what's been really good is I had an interest in copy and words and coming at it from that direction. And so being in a small team, you can kind of drive that development. You can go, well, I'm into that, so maybe we should offer this more as an agency, really. So it's definitely, I think that now I think back, I think it's kind of always been there, really. I seem to remember having a project in one of my first jobs where I had to lay out an annual report and got sent the copy on the Friday from the client, and then took it home and read it all. And it was for an annual report for like a building company, and it was really boring, but I was obviously trying to see if I could get the content to like inform what the form might be. So yeah, I think the kind of writing around the work has been really important, and then just trying to do a bit of research and sort of like read up about that, really read some kind of quite good stuff that's in the world of copywriting. What I do like about that world is they have that discussion a lot more about the end user and the audience than I think the design world does. I think sometimes design world could be a bit guilty of getting a bit echo chambery and just focusing on the craft of the work, where writing seems to be much more kind of open to having the conversation about who's reading it, what you want them to feel like as a result of reading it, how do you get them to listen, things like that.
Yeah, I agree. So then going back to the brand identity itself, what makes a good brand identity? And good might not even be the right word. I think maybe effective is a better one. I think it's important to strip out subjectivity, isn't it, when you're working, when you're doing what we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because I don't even know whether it's like necessarily brand identity, but just work as a whole. So, because I try and keep, because we do creative communication is the way that we talk about it. Now that can be brand identity work, or it can be something like potentially a bit weird, like an event, or so. I guess that I suppose what makes a good piece of work obviously will be how well the language speaks to you. I think that's one thing. I think the kind of history of our studio has been that we've always been really focused on having strong ideas in the work, which is a bit ambiguous. It's hard to know really what that means. But I think that what's happened is our portfolio of what we've been asked to do has grown, because in the early stages when we were doing design projects with quite strong ideas in there, we then got asked to do, like that's why we were getting asked to do ad campaign work, because we'd obviously demonstrated that we had ideas. So I think that's a really important thing to do within any piece of work, really. The sort of work that I quite like that we haven't done, but other stuff that I see that I really like, is I quite like things that are like a bit unrefined, like a little bit, I don't mean ugly, I just mean like not really, really polished. So, because that to me sort of translates as like there's an urgency to what's being talked about, and like there's an importance to it, if that makes sense. So like, Bloomberg Business Week, there's a designer that worked on that called Richard Turley, and the work that he did was amazing and quite unrefined, but probably had loads of refinement gone into it that you can't tell. But just, it seemed the work's almost kind of like, at times, kind of like angry. But I don't know, I really like that sort of thing. It's lucky really for me that I quite like work to be a bit kind of undesigned, because that's kind of a bit like my work, really.
Well, that's a nice bridge into BT's new logo and identity. So I know the answer, but what are your thoughts on that logo?
Well, it's not the thing. When I saw that news article that came out about that logo, I think we'd had a day that day we'd had a few conversations about PR and projects that needed PR. And I guess, I don't know, I just sort of saw that, and it wasn't like, I wasn't reacting to the actual design of the logo, because, all right, it's not like the best logo you've ever seen, but it was just the fact that there was a news story attached to a black and white logo, which you probably never really see it in that state, like once it's applied. And it just made me think, is this a sort of ploy? Maybe it was like being really cynical, but it felt like a ploy to get news about your new logo. It was like, I tell you what we'll do is we'll share the black and white version with The Guardian, and they'll write one of those pieces, which is like, oh, it cost this much to design the logo. And yeah, in a way, I'm less bothered about the logo. I'm more upset about the fact that maybe it's more important that a shit logo gets news than a good logo is designed. I don't know.
It's hard not to be cynical when you see things like this,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
hard what to believe. But then the logo, I mean, context, as you've already said, is significant here, and the actual application of it is going to look very different to what was shared and what was kind of widely criticised. But the logo itself in any identity project is literally the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that needs to go into it.
Yeah.
Yes, it's easy to judge, especially the Twitterati. It's really easy to judge and make it binary and make it either good or bad.
We're really bad for that. Like as an industry, I think that, especially with Twitter, that's probably not helping at all. But that, like that kind of getting an absolute battering, like a piece of work getting a battering, and I don't know, I'm just not for that. I just think that if you see something you don't like, let's probably just leave it and just talk about the stuff that you've seen that's really good. Or better still, do a really good piece of work yourself. It's just, I think we're a bit guilty of, kicking the shit out of a piece of work where it's like, I think you've said this before, that, we're just trying to put food on the table. And also, you don't know, there's websites dedicated to, oh, here's the old logo, here's the new one. What does everybody think? And obviously you get loads of people on there that get quite, like irate at the new logo if they don't like it as much as the old one. But, and it's easy to, that kind of argument that, like, I could have designed better, and you think, yeah, well, you could have done, but could you have navigated all the complexity that existed in this job in order to get where we got to? Like, could you get all the stakeholders to buy in? Could you get it through all the kind of various hurdles it's got to jump first? That's why, I try not to be too kind of cross about other people's creative work, really, because you don't know, they might be seeing that stuff and be really gutted because they put tons of work into it, and then everyone's slagging it off left, right, and centre.
Yeah, equally, Dave Trott, he talks about using the language of the professional. So whether you like it or not is largely irrelevant, or should be irrelevant, when you come to being a professional in this industry, and only time will tell if it was an effective evolution of their identity. Without sights of what BT's objectives were for the identity, we can't ever really truly know, I suppose.
Yeah, well,
but you're right. It's so easy to just stick things up and hate at it, but there's so much involvement of so many people and so many variables. But to steal a previous guest's term, it's a false binary. It's not good and bad.
Yeah, well, it's what's interesting, I think, is a few months back, I saw something that was written by, it was a copywriter actually, where they'd kind of gone, they'd say, I can't remember what the piece of work was, but they'd gone, oh, I don't think this really works, but then proffered 3 suggestions as to how it might have been stronger. And I thought that was brilliant, because no one ever does that. And yeah, I'm not saying that, like, the response to BT's logo should be people chucking loads of logos about, but it was just quite interesting to get some actual insight from someone who was saying, I don't think this works, here's another way we could have done it. And actually the other ways that he wrote the copy were really good. So I was like, wow, no one ever does that. Like, it'd be great to see more of that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it sounds very refreshing. So going back to Peter and Paul, do you have a particular project that you're particularly proud of that you can tell us about?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, this, because obviously there are loads, having been involved in loads of very different types of projects as well. I think, just to go back to creating kind of identities, brand identity work, and then rolling those things out, it sounds like a total cop-out, but actually the project we're working on at the minute is going to be something. I think that's one of my favourite projects that we've ever worked on, and curiously, because it being the projects for the London Borough of Culture, curiously, because it's had to have so much work at the, what you might call the front end, like a lot of discussion before the work began, it's made, I think, the work feel quite well rounded, I think anyway. But other than that, I quite like it when we get involved in projects that seem like a bit odd, and they don't fall into the realm of what you might traditionally know as kind of graphic design or brand communication. So we did a project where it was for Leeds Arts University, and because of the restrictions of the brief, it actually made the work actually quite interesting. And they were having a celebration for their 170th year, and they wanted an exhibition that could be put up and taken down in one night. So obviously that gave us loads of restrictions, because if you're going to start making things out of wood, it's not that easy to take down. So the long story short is we worked with a fashion designer to create these like weird sort of large, almost like futuristic garments that sort of came down. And on it was printed the work, and they stood on plinths at the little party. And it was just good because it was like you could see, well, the process of working with a fashion designer was really interesting. And then actually seeing the work, the exhibition at the event, and seeing that, like people were talking to the exhibition and like buying it drinks. So it was like, it just was, and then working with a group of students which were happy to do that and just trying to coordinate it all. It was, I think it goes back to that, seeing the work in context really. And, like actually seeing that the work that you've done has had an impact on some people and changed the situation and created a bit of a like atmosphere. It's quite easy to forget that that's what the work's there to do when you sat at a sort of Apple Mac creating the design or creating the graphics. So it was, I think that goes down as one of my favourites, just because it was such a strange project, really.
Yeah, it's nice having that variety.
Yeah, I think it's that's it. I think it's like, what we do is, I'm happy for us to do anything that's kind of creative project which helps any organisation really. So if that's making garments at a show, or if it's a more traditional sort of piece of identity work, then that's fine. But because I suppose I'm a bit of a firm believer in like making really good creative work can actually change quite a lot, can't it? Clients want quite big leaps to happen. They want sort of disproportionate change to happen. And I don't know, I've come all the way back round again to go, I think the quality of the creative work is what will get us there. I'm bound to say that though, I suppose.
Well, pleased you are. You're also increasingly interested in the behavioural sciences, and listeners of this show will already be no doubt familiar with Nudgestock that you and I both attended recently the other week.
Mm-hmm.
You actually worked on its new identity.
Yeah, well, that came about. It's one of them curious things, really. It's quite often the connections you make are quite often come through the people you know, don't they? So a friend of ours has become a behavioural scientist there. So we got the project to redesign the identity for Nudgestock, and it was quite a sort of almost like an old style project for us. Is that it was a visual identity. There was no deeper work. There was no deeper sort of positioning work or strategy needed. But we just designed the kind of identity and the movement. But what I thought, again, to go back to that, like the garments thing, what's quite interesting is being at the event and seeing it all there. I know that from the discussions we'd had with Ogilvy working on it, is that they're keen to make Nudgestock a bit of a bigger thing over time, and move it back to London potentially. I don't know if that's kind of a definite, but obviously there seems to be a sense of wanting it to kind of grow up a little bit. And often I think with the work that we do, it is that signalling thing, isn't it? That sometimes when you're just kind of met with the fact that somebody's put the effort in and the budget in to kind of create some work, and it's sort of made the whole experience feel a little bit more proper, then that can quite often have quite transformative effect, really. So the discussions that we've had with the clients since the event, they've seemed really like, it feels like we've, it's really grown up and, it's really kind of developed this year. So we were involved in doing that.
And was it nice to see that in situ?
Oh, it was amazing. Yeah. Like the event itself is great. It's funny. My interest in behavioural science is kind of just my interest in a bit of everything, really, because what sort of happened was, before I had a child, basically, I used to live at the studio pretty much. And I did that not because I was sort of made to, but just because that was my way to get in the work to a quality, really. So used to be there till God knows what time. And then when I had my son, I realised I wasn't going to be able to do that anymore. So I did use the opportunity, really, to when he was a little baby, and there's quite a lot of sitting around that has to happen. I did try and consume, like I tried to self-school a little bit, and reading some of that stuff, and like tried to consume loads of stuff, because I was just like, right, well, I'm going to have to learn now. I'm going to have to bring something else to the table which isn't late nights. So that's what I did. And reading, I was already kind of familiar with Rory, and and then reading some other stuff around, anything that he kind of recommended, like Dan Ariely and things like that. But then from there, we'd got increasingly involved in projects where there was talk of kind of marketing and data. So, like I said, because the work that we'd done had always had kind of ideas quite central, it was natural progression, really, that we were getting asked to do projects that were kind of quite campaign-based. And I always remember probably the first time we had a situation where a client had gone, well, we've looked at some data and the work's not having the results we were hoping for, so it mustn't be right. And that was a bit of a shock to me, really. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to maybe learn a bit more about this sort of thing, which is, I guess, marketing, which in the design world is, I suppose, regarded as a separate thing. I don't know whether the kind of climate's maybe a little bit different in the north of England to maybe London, but where, say, in London, there does seem to be a clear divide between you can go to a design agency or you can go to an advertising agency. Whereas I think certainly in Sheffield, we get all sorts of different types of work coming through the door. So getting into sort of behavioural science, if you like, and reading up a bit more about planning and writing and like understanding, brands and how they work. And I just tried to not draw a line between anything and just try and be as aware as I could about everything. And hopefully that's kind of helps, really. It kind of helps understand what the context of the work that we do is, and like how's somebody going to use it, what do we hope that it will do at the end of the day. So that's how it kind of happened. It came out of the desperation of worrying that I was going to become stupid overnight due to tiredness. And it's just, there's loads of good stuff that, I don't know, it was loads of good stuff that came out of that time, really, and just trying to understand as much as I could about everything, just like the world of creative communication, everything.
Yeah, and becoming a parent, as you said, is such a significant change of your own status and what you have available. So I suppose it's a bit like a sportsman or a footballer, say, aging and losing their pace. They have to add something else to their game.
Yeah, they have to read loads of books.
Read loads of books, picture books, no doubt.
Yeah, that's it. I was definitely on that, and I think there's a book called Anatomy of Humbug. Have you ever read that one?
No, I have heard of it, but no, I've not read it.
There's a bit in that which kind of almost summed up the whole, like, basically what we do, like basically the whole sort of system of what we do. And it talks about digital and analogic communication. So he uses like a digital clock face he uses a clock face as an example. So a digital clock face will say it's 2:27. That's your information. You know what I mean? You can't get that wrong, really, so long as you understand what a 2 and a 7 is. But an analog clock face will give you that information spatially. So the idea is that it is that messaging and signalling thing where there will be a message, but the way that you say it, the way it's delivered, that's analogic. So that's like, so if I see you in the street, walk past and say hello, the information is the word hello, but the way I've said it will have so much more kind of impact than just the word itself. So it becomes like you can't get away from that. So you can't say anything without having a way that you've said it. And actually, getting more complicated is what you don't say also has a bearing. And in a way, it was like, that's basically what we do, isn't it? That's basically the whole of what we do. It's not just what we're saying, it's how it's delivered. Going back to being in the room at Nudgestock and them feeling like they'd grown up a little bit because they've got this kind of identity that moved and had animated elements. It was not just the fact that it was, Nudgestock, it was also how it was being delivered visually.
Yeah, and that is exactly where the overlap lies between whether you're coming from a marketing or design perspective. Anyone who's involved in communications, that overlap into behavioural sciences is so significant. And the messaging versus signalling is exactly that, because it's all about the context. My favourite example is from Bob Hoffman, who says if you walk into a room and announce that you're the best looking person in that room, what you've said is one thing, but actually what you've communicated is something entirely different, and that's that you're a bit of a prick.
Yeah.
So Nudge Stop was down south, and as you alluded to, I believe they are taking it on the road next year, but no doubt it will remain down south. Would you say that Sheffield punches above its weight being up north, or do you typically find yourself having this pull down south for events or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it that the north has got some brilliant creative people in the north. So it's not like a kind of barren landscape where, you know, it's all going on in London, and, you know, like there's us in Sheffield and nobody else. There's like tons of brilliant people in the north of England. I think I do actually feel like, in a way, the city punches above its weight, but maybe the only people that know that are people like me that live in Sheffield, really, because it's quite close to my heart now. We joined the D&AD this year, sort of as a member for the first time, and it's a really great organisation, the D&AD is. But whenever they have anything, which is invariably down south, when they send the little questionnaire back, that is the thing I'm always saying is, let's get it back up here. We need more of this stuff up here, and almost like donating our space and going, you can have it here if you want. But they do lots of brilliant stuff in London, and I think that if it was more stretched across the country, it would be even more brilliant, really.
Yeah, well, no, I agree. I think there's creative communities spread nationwide, and it's important that London isn't allowed to just become this little bubble that it I suppose kind of is in some respects.
Yeah. Well, I think in a way, I remember when I did a placement in Bristol, actually, this guy said, I'm really proud to be flying the flag for creativity outside of London. And I've always remembered that it's kind of, in a way, I'm slightly proud that, you know, we're able to create work that, well, I think is all right. And it's not in London where you'd expect it to be. And I think that's a massive part of our identity, actually, being in Sheffield where we are.
Yeah. Have you ever considered venturing down south? Has the agency ever considered having any other premises down south?
Well, I think that a lot of our clients, I mean, we do tend to go to London a lot. A lot of our clients are actually London-based. So I think it's been kind of talked about before in a bit of a kind of like jokey way. Oh, you can go and set up the London office or whatever. But I don't think really it would. I mean, I don't think it would ever really be a serious thing to happen because, like I say, I think that being in this city plays so much to kind of our identity as a studio and who we are and the type of work we make and our opinions, I suppose.
So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger, but that's not stopped us asking. So we've had a couple in, Lee, starting with Matt, who is a designer. He has asked, what are your thoughts on Comic Sans?
It's well, I think that probably because I don't tend to do that like kind of granular work, I've let go of my kind of being really offended by typefaces. But there's been like what I think's been quite interesting about Comic Sans is there's been some other projects that have kind of span out of that one font that have actually been like quite good conceptual projects. So years ago, I went to the Royal College of Art's end of year show, and somebody had taken Comic Sans and then done humorous sans, and I think serious sans, and then there was another one that was hilarious sans. So what they'd done is they'd almost built around that typeface various levels of ugliness, where serious was quite nice, and then other ones were like you went up to comic, and then hilarious was ridiculous. It was like even more ugly than Comic Sans. So Comic Sans doesn't really enter my field of vision that much, to be honest. But I suppose that project just came to mind because what I thought was quite interesting about it is when you've got something it comes attached with it a certain meaning, doesn't it? I think it's quite interesting that someone took that meaning and tried to do something with it. So it's not really an answer, but I wouldn't probably use it in a project, but I just thought it was good as a bit of a jump off point really to doing an interesting project from it.
Yeah, and I think it's quite refreshing your point there that I guess you've kind of let go of any feelings towards or against a font. But again, to be honest, that echoes our earlier point about whether something's effective or not. It's not really a like or do not like. So it's another Murray Calder false binary. And in fact, I recall seeing something probably a couple of years ago now where Comic Sans on a legibility scale had scored significantly higher than most common fonts, and therein lies the argument to use it in certain textbooks for children of certain age because of the legibility. So I think it's more about what's effective rather than let's all hate on Comic Sans. But it's certainly not one for my gravestone.
It gets back to that, like understanding where the work is being used. And I do wonder sometimes whether kind of like the graphic design industry, I'm not saying like, so you must use Comic Sans. I'm just saying that understanding where the work is being used is something that's probably quite common in other design disciplines, like product design or architecture. And I wonder whether we kind of sometimes miss that really in favour of a bit of a conversation about craft or like what something looks like.
Yeah, and it's easy for designers, probably more so when you start off, to almost behave and operate like stylists. So you just want something to look aesthetically beautiful, and everything kind of tends towards looking, incorporating your favourite typefaces or whatever it might be, and following trends. Which certainly in my world, which is more marketing and advertising, I suppose, versus pure design industry, is the last place you want to be, where you all look and sound the same.
Yeah, I mean, I always think though it's I don't know, it's like when you see badly designed ads are kind of they're kind of like as wrong as design with no ideas in them. So it's like it'd be good to see a kind of like bit more of a mixing of those two things, so everybody was kind of had their standards at a certain level really.
And question 2 comes from David, who is an art director. He has asked, do designers spend too much time behind a screen and not enough time messing around with marker pens and Letraset? So I think David's showing his age there a bit by mentioning Letraset.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably true that we spend a bit too much time behind screens. Whether it's getting back to making or just getting away from the screen and back to the people who you're doing the work with and for, yeah, I would agree that like being at a screen is probably not the best place for that. I know other designers that are, they use the screen for doing and they come away from it for thinking and any other parts of making, stuff like that. And I would say that it's probably we're going to find, aren't we, in years to come, there'll be a piece of research which basically tells us that all those years that we stared at this like little glass rectangle, it did something to our brains which didn't enable the right kind of free thinking. So I think get away from the screen whenever you can, whether that's like getting pens out and paint or whether it's just posing as a mature student at an open day. Getting away from it is definitely a thing that's kind of a good thing to do, really.
Yeah, I can't remember the last time I actually used Letraset. I still have some Letraset, but no, I've never used it not in the last few years anyhow. I'm a big fan of marker pens and pads though.
Yeah, we've done quite a lot of kind of projects where the physical mark making has become like part of the graphic language, and is definitely something that we do get back to occasionally.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we're very conscious of here. We try and encourage people not to just spend the entire working day behind a screen, but equally your earlier point about just immersing yourself in everything to do with the brief and the client and the context of the problem, and then walking away from it, which often leads to some sort of breakthrough. It's hard to do when you're sat behind a screen all day.
Yeah. I mean, I think the amount of times that the idea will actually come when you're on your journey from work back to home, or like really late at night. Once you start to notice that, once you realise it's not just a coincidence, you can actually create that situation a bit more. It's definitely like, it is away from the screen is probably where the brain starts to function a bit more. And also you've got to kind of slightly forget about the work, so it almost passes it back to your subconscious a little bit, and it's that solves the problem.
Yeah, there's a behavioural scientist in you talking now.
Yeah, well, maybe.
So the final part of the interview, Lee, is our 4 pertinent posers. So number 1, what advice would you give to your younger self, apart from reading The Guardian?
Understand what the Guardian actually is before you think people are talking about the Middlewich Guardian is one. I guess really, I suppose my introduction into the world of writing, if I'd have listened a little bit more to what I was good at and not focused quite so quickly when I was younger, then I might have been able to develop this a little bit more and a little bit earlier, if you see what I mean. So I kind of got it into my head that, it's going to have to be visual. That's all I can do. And yet, when I think back, I was actually quite good I was quite good at school in English. And that's probably, I was actually getting better grades in English than I was in art, despite going, no, it's definitely art that I need to do. So I guess it's interesting. If you kind of listen to what you're good at a little bit more, then you can actually discover a bit more about yourself. I was recently at a university talking to some students, and one of the students had showed me a design portfolio on a website, and then she had a link on a website to her illustration work as well. Now, her illustration work was great. So I was kind of saying to her, after she told me that she really wanted to be a designer, I was like, right, well, let's imagine I've got 2 briefs that are in sealed envelopes. One of them's a graphics one and one of them's an illustration one. Which brief do you want to do? And she was going, maybe it's the illustration one. And it was just quite interesting that once she kind of connected with what she was really naturally really good at, it sort of got her to think a little bit more about the identity of her work and what she could push, and that would hopefully help next time she had a project brief, that she could bring in a bit of her ability as an illustrator into that.
I think certainly from my perspective, and it's something that I've talked about outside of the pod quite passionately about, is when is the route that people are almost forced to take into our industry is you need to be good at drawing as a child, which leads you into the arts at school, which is typically drawing and painting, or certain things in between. And only then, if you're fortunate enough to have some sort of design lessons available, typically they're only at 6th form, so you've already had to jump the hurdle of, or tick the box of, being able to draw or paint. And then latterly, you might take an art foundation course, and it's only then, certainly from my perspective and lots of people I know and talk to, that graphic design and advertising and all the sexy stuff that I'm into is even on your radar. I think there's a really strong argument to present design in its many guises at an earlier stage in the education system, so that more people are aware of it.
Yeah, I mean, I always come up against that thing where when people ask you, what do you do? And you go, I'm a designer, and they say, what do you design? And then you have to kind of like go through that slightly uncomfortable process of trying to describe it. And I guess that education could come a lot sooner, really, because it's sort of, graphic design is kind of everything that you probably look at when you leave the house, really, that isn't an object, or is it like it's 2-dimensional.
Absolutely. Number 2, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
I think this is pitch briefs that ask you to define your quote unquote approach, because I think that's quite ambiguous, isn't it? What's your approach to this project? I'm not going to get into the whole should we pitch or should we not, because I think that's for another day. But when you get a brief that's a pitch, which is it's quite a dangerous scenario to be in anyway. I think when you're asked to give your approach, that can mean a whole kind of plethora of things, can't it? It can mean, what's your approach to designing this piece of work? What colours are you going to use? What, etc. What are the images going to look like? Or it can be, what stages are you going to go through? And I think we probably need some kind of standardising of language, because I don't know whether you've ever been in this situation, but occasionally when you pitch for things, you can sometimes be going in with something that's not entirely what they're expecting to see, and that might be that you've only described the stages you'll go through, and they're expecting to see more than that, or the opposite of that can happen. So we probably need like a bit of a, tell me the stages you'll go through, or show me some stuff.
asking that question also suggests that there is a right answer,
Yeah.
which there can't be.
That's it. I mean, there's a really good designer, a pentagram designer, who writes some brilliant articles called Michael Beirut, and he wrote a really good thing that was like, you go through that process and you describe your process, as in, like, let's say it's a 1, 2, 3 thing, but quite often the solution to a project can be quite a random thing, really. It might not always conform to those processes.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just about giving someone the confidence that they think, oh, you could go through the processes, so I can tick that box. So there you go, you get the project, if you like.
And it's hard to measure creativity. Well, in fact, it's probably impossible. And Rory Sutherland countless times has talked about precisely this type of instance where something might happen or an idea might come about, but you post-rationalize it to give a reason that sounds plausible, that does make sense, like almost that there is a linear process, whereas more often than not, it won't be a linear process, and it could be something, quite ridiculous that led to having an idea, but you have an urge to appeal to the kind of rational brain and for it to make sense.
That's it. Yeah, it's it is quite a random. It's quite a random process a lot of the time, really. You go through the stages in order to manage that random process, probably.
Yeah. So number 3, and I know, like lots of parents, you've rediscovered an appreciation of Roald Dahl books, so that can influence your answer. But the question is, any books that you would recommend?
Yeah, well, there's probably loads, but not to keep you here all day. I reckon, so to go like just traditional sort of design, if you like, if there are any designers listening, there's a book by Michael Beirut which is called How To, and then it's got like a massive list after it. And it's a really good, honest account of what being a designer is actually like, which you don't often get. So he shows work in that book, which is like stuff that didn't go, the thing you couldn't get the client to agree to and things like that. And it's just quite fascinating because it doesn't like kind of polish it up or anything like that. It just gives it you. When I read that book, I was like, yeah, this is kind of sounds like what my day to day is like, which is quite good. And so there's, to go a bit wider than that, there's like there's a book called Made to Stick, and I think it's by what they call Chip and Ed Heath. I think, is it Heath? I don't know. I might have got that wrong. But the book is called Made to Stick. And it's basically a book about how we can get ideas to stick. And it's basically, I reckon it's the best opening 4 pages of a book that's non-fiction that I've ever read. And it properly gets you in there, and it's really, really good. Their kind of idea is that they're trying to sort of say, well, there could be some like kind of rough rules that you could follow to try and get your ideas to stick a bit more. And there's some stuff in there that I totally use day to day, really, is to just kind of keep remembering what they talk about in that book. It's really good.
Any that you can share?
One of them is they talk about, oh God, sorry, the people in our studio are going to they get so bored of me talking about this. So it's they talk about how journalists are taught how to write articles. And it's like a kind of inverted triangle model where you start with the broader information that gives you what you need to know. And you get more and more detailed as you move down the triangle. And they do that so that if another story comes in, that you can literally just chop off the bottom and the article will still make sense. And it's that idea of not burying the lead, which is certainly within writing, I think that's such a kind of useful little rule that you could take a bit of text, read it, and almost change the order of what was said and make it load stronger, because the bit often that is the lead or the most interesting bit might quite often be towards the end of the passage of text rather than the first thing you read.
Our colleague, our PR director here, Natalie, she uses that with all of her press releases. I think it's quite a fairly common style for her to adopt.
Yeah.
For that reason.
Yeah, and then the last one was that Creativity Inc. book, which is that book about Pixar. And I think it's Ed Catmull that wrote that. And it's just like, I think it's one of the best books I've ever read about creative endeavour. And just that, like how committed they are to the process of creating a piece of work and doing that thing where they go, it is going to be crap to start off with, and you have to accept that. I mean, that is like one of the best tips ever, isn't it? Like, you've got to accept that it's going to be crap to begin with. And as soon as you do that, it's like really freeing, because you're not trying to get that like perfect thing. There's another thing, isn't there? That's like, don't ask if it's perfect, just ask if it's moved the project forward at all. And yeah, all that comes out of that Creativity Inc. book. It's just brilliant. That book is absolutely amazing.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to all of those on the episode. Do you have a favourite Roald Dahl book? I'm dying to know now.
Well, because he's still a little bit young, so I've not really gone from, like he hasn't got the patience to go through an entire one. But we have watched both Charlie and the Chocolate Factory films now. Probably, I'd say we're into the hundreds of times. So I've got to start there, because I reckon I know that script now, like off by heart. I should do it as like a kind of test to see if I can get from the beginning to the end of the film.
In character.
Yeah, in all the characters.
And finally, we always dedicate the show to somebody, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your view, to our guest, who also has to give their reason why.
Well, this is going to seem a bit odd, because the person, I can't remember her full name, which is a bit embarrassing. I'm pretty sure it's Claire Williams. Now, she was a lecturer at my college in Cheshire, where we went in Northwich. And so I did a BTEC in graphic design, and the course that I'd walked into was quite old-fashioned, and it wasn't really the most cutting edge of graphic design experiences ever. Like, we did one of the college trips was to go and draw some old cars in a museum. So it wasn't, you know what I mean? It wasn't going to get us into university quite clearly. And she turned up and gave everybody a bit of a kick up the arse, and was kind of hated for it initially, because it was quite a jolt, because she was like, look, if you don't pull your fingers out, then you're just not going to go anywhere. And then as we got to know her a bit more, she properly dedicated some time to getting my portfolio into a state that might get me into university. And when she did that, she was actually teaching another class, and I used to sort of sneak in, and she would sort of like sneak over to one side and give me advice about what to do with this work and how to present it. And subsequently, she basically helped me get into university. And without her, I'd pretty much not be doing what I'm doing, I think. So yeah, wow. I had to kind of think about it quite carefully. But if only I was absolutely sure of what her full name was. Terrible. But yeah, if there's any way of anyone finding out, then yeah, she was amazing.
Oh, that's a very worthy dedication. You should try and find her. You should try and look her up, at least, to ping her a message.
I tried to. It's now impossible, because the actual college is now closed, which is really sad, because I don't know what kids in that part of the country are now going to do who are really into art and design and, just want to do that. God knows what they'll do now. But yeah, it's now closed, so it's sort of now impossible to try and find any actual information about that place.
Oh, well, a worthy dedication nonetheless.
Yeah, I reckon.
So as a final call to action, head over to this episode online, and we'll share all of the links to everything discussed in the last hour. How else can people get more Lee Davies? Well,
I think that probably the best place is to follow the studio, I think, on social media, on Twitter and Instagram. It's just Peter_and_Paul. I think my own Twitter account is probably not the best place to look, because I think that I'd like to think that I kind of I was an early adopter, but what it actually is I've got a really crap Twitter handle because I didn't understand how it worked. So it's just my full name and _32, because that's what my email was at the time. But I think in terms of stuff that would be actually useful to you, I tend to manage our Twitter account through the studio. So most of what happens in our studio ends up on there. So I think that'd probably be the best place, really.
But you do share some wonderful private eye covers on your own personal Twitter account.
Yeah, they're amazing, because it goes back to that thing, like that is work that's not all that refined, but is like really good at the same time.
It is, yeah. No, I 100% agree. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Lee. It's been a real pleasure, as I expected to talk again.
Yeah, thanks very much.
And thank you to everyone listening. Please continue to share and leave reviews so we can hopefully reach more people and correct the ratio of nonsense that's being spouted by Gary V and the like. Get in touch with questions to put to our guests, feedback, and anything else you want to share by emailing hello@calltoaction.co.
I can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try. I can't get no call to action. Oh, I can't get no call to action. Yeah, hey, hey.